We live in a strange time. Extraordinary events keep happening that undermine the stability of our world. Suicide bombings, waves of refugees, Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, the mainstream media, social justice, critical race theory, COVID-19, even Brexit. Yet those in control seem unable to deal with it. No one has any vision of a different or a better kind of future. This is a story about how over the past 40 years, politicians, finances and technological utopians, rather than face up to the real complexities of the world, retreated. Instead, they constructed a simpler version of the world in order to hang on to power. And as this fake world grew, all of us went along with it, because the simplicity was reassuring. Even those who thought they were attacking the system, the radicals, the artists, the musicians, and our whole counterculture, actually became part of the trickery. Because they too had retreated into the make-believe world, which is why their opposition has no effect and nothing ever changes. But this retreat into a dream world allowed dark and destructive forces to fester and grow outside. Forces that are now returning to pierce the fragile surface of our carefully constructed fake world. Hafez al-Assad had died in 2000. His son, Bashar al-Assad, became the new president. But he couldn't escape the inexorable logic of what his father had started 20 years before. His father had sent Shiite suicide bombers to attack the Americans in Lebanon. Now, as America and Britain invaded Iraq, Assad would decided that he would copy his father. What he was about to let loose would tear the Arab world apart, and then come back to try and destroy him. Bashar al-Assad was never supposed to have been president. It was always going to have been his elder brother Basil, but before he could take his father's place, Basil had died in a car crash. It was Bashar that succeeded his father, being the next in line, who then moved into the palace his father had built above Damascus. Up to this point, Bashar had not been interested in politics. He was fascinated by computers. He founded the Syrian Computer Society and brought the internet to the country. His favorite band was the Electric Light Orchestra, but now he was president, and he set out to attack America. Bashar Assad was convinced that the invasion of Iraq was just a first step of a plot by the Western powers to take over the whole of the Middle East. He knew that the invasion had outraged many of the radical Islamists in Syria, and what they most wanted to do was to go to Iraq and can kill Americans. So Bashar instructed the Syrian intelligence services to help them do this. Syrian agents set up a pipeline that began to feed thousands of militants across the border into the heart of the insurgency. And it grew. Within a year, almost all the foreign fighters from across the world were coming through Syria. And they brought suicide bombing with them. The Americans estimated that 90% of the suicide bombers were foreign fighters, but it began to run out of control. Most of the jihadists joined the group Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but then turned to killing Shiites in an attempt to create a civil war. The force that had originally been invented by the Shiites, suicide bombing, now started to kill them.
A moment of silence before people realized what was happening.
A few seconds ago, we just had repeated explosions in the street below me. People are now fleeing in terror from the central square around the mosque. This is what everybody feared. We just heard another explosion in the distance, that somebody would try to target this religious festival to try to bring about a sectarian conflict in Iraq.
There was panic, a terrified stampede. But some of these people were running into the next bombs. We counted at least 6 separate explosions.
Tony Blair and George Bush were faced by disaster. Iraq was imploding, while at home, they were being accused of lying to their own people to justify the invasion. What they desperately needed was something that would show them the invasion was having a good effect in the Arab world, so they made an extraordinary decision. They turned for help to the man who they'd always insisted was one of the world's most dangerous tyrants, Colonel Gaddafi. But now, instead of making him the enemy, they set out to make him an ally. It was going to be the largest implementation of perception management. A man who had been created by the West as a fake global terrorist was now going to be turned into a fake hero of democracy, and everyone, not just politicians, would become involved. Public relations, academics, television presenters, spies, and even musicians were all going to help reinvent Colonel Gaddafi. It would show just how many people in the Western establishment had, at this point, become the engineers of this fake world. Ever since being accused of the Lockerbie bombing, Colonel Gaddafi had been a complete outcast. The West had imposed sanctions on Libya and the economy was falling apart. But then suddenly Tony Blair broke live into the BBC Evening News.
Prime Minister Tony Blair is about to make a statement the BBC understands from Downing Street. It's of international significance. He'll be making his statement at any moment. Now we can see pictures of him in Durham City. Here he is.
Colonel Gaddafi has confirmed that Libya has in the past sought to develop weapons of mass destruction capabilities. Libya has now declared its intention to dismantle its weapons of mass destruction completely. This decision by Colonel Gaddafi is an historic one and a courageous one, and I applaud it.
Today in Tripoli, the leader of Libya, Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi, publicly confirmed his commitment to disclose and dismantle all weapons of mass destruction programs in his country.
Colonel Gaddafi now became for Western politicians a heroic figure. His decision to give up his weapons of mass destruction seemed to prove that the invasion of Iraq could transform the Middle East, and Tony Blair traveled to meet Gaddafi in his desert tent to welcome him back into what one journalist called the community of civilized nations. But, just as in the past, nothing was what it seemed with Colonel Gaddafi. In reality, Gaddafi did not really have the terrifying weapons of mass destruction that he was promising to destroy. His nuclear program had stuttered to a halt and never produced anything dangerous. He had managed to buy some equipment on the black market, but his technicians had been unable to assemble it. His biological weapons were non-existent. all he had was some old mustard gas in leaking barrels. But now, he had to pretend to have a terrifying arsenal of weapons, and the West had to pretend they had avoided another global threat. Soon enough, the made-up stories became even more complicated. As part of the deal, the West said that if Gaddafi admitted that Libya had done the Lockerbie bombing, they would lift the sanctions. But many of those who had investigated Lockerbie were still convinced that Libya wasn't responsible, and that it was Syria who were actually responsible. But Colonel Gaddafi confessed. However, his son Saif was interviewed about this confession. He said that his father was simply pretending that he had been behind the Lockerbie bombing to get the sanctions lifted. That new lies were being built on top of old to construct a completely false reality.
You have to accept, or you had to accept at that time, the responsibility, because you have to accept responsibilities, you have to pay compensation in order to get rid of the sanction. It means we did that not because we are convinced that we did it, but because to find an exit out of this nightmare.
So what you're saying is that you accept responsibility, but you're not admitting that you did it?
Yes.
And this is all a sham, you're saying, just to get sanctions over with so that you can start normal diplomatic relations with the West?
Okay. What's wrong with that?
It's a very cynical way to behave as a country, isn't it? Many people would say.
First of all, I mean, the Americans in the British, they told us to write that letter. They told us to pay compensation. And then they opened their embassies and they restored the relation and they came to us. It was their game, not our game.
Public relations companies then came to Libya to do what they called reframing the narrative. One firm was paid $3 million to turn Gaddafi into what they described as a modern world thinker. They did this by bringing other famous world thinkers and TV presenters out to Libya to meet the colonel and discuss his theories.
Hello and welcome to Libya in the Global Age, a conversation with Muammar Gaddafi. But first, let's get the story so far of Libya.
One world thinker was Lord Anthony Giddens. Coincidentally, he had a theory, which he called the Third Way, which had inspired Tony Blair. Colonel Gaddafi had his own theory, which was called the Third Universal Theory. Lord Giddens later wrote about his talks with the Libyan leader. Colonel Gaddafi likes my term the Third Way, because his own political philosophy is a version of this idea. He makes many intelligent and perceptive points. It was then that Gaddafi had achieved his lifelong dream. He was invited to address the United Nations. He spent almost 2 hours explaining his Third Universal Theory, and also demanded an investigation into the shootings of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King. When he was in New York, Gaddafi was offered a tent, just like the one he had at home in the gardens of a grand mansion. The man who made the offer was Donald Trump.
I can tell you something else. What? I dealt with Gaddafi. Where's the lead? What'd you do? Excuse me. I rented him a piece of land. He paid me more for one night than the land was worth for the whole year or for 2 years. And then I didn't let him use the land. That's what we should be doing. Was that over in New Jersey? I don't want to use the word screw, but I screwed him. That's what we